Hi everyone, Nigel here. This morning at Winchester Vineyard Church, my talk was about Jonah Chapter 1. And when I was preparing this talk, I realised there was just too much material to include in my Sunday morning talk. And so when I was going through it with Jo, she suggested that some of what I had prepared, I took out of the main talk and included in a bonus video. This is a bit of an experiment. We haven't done anything like this. And so that's what I'm doing here. I've got a few slides to show you. This is for people who want to dig deeper into the Bible text of the story of Jonah chapter 1. I find it fascinating. It's not for everyone, okay? This isn't really my original material. I've taken it from a study I did, which you could do as well if you wanted. It's with the Bible Project. They have a thing called Classroom. You can find it on their website. You just go to bibleproject.com/classroom. It's a 20 to 30 hour Bible study, in-depth Bible study on the book of Jonah with Professor Tim Mackey. He's the sort of brain behind all of the Bible Project's theology stuff. Anybody can access that for free and work through it for free. That's what I'm doing. And you would be welcome to do the same. You can just find the details at their website there. I'm assuming that you have heard my talk from Winchester Vineyard Church on Sunday the 28th of Feb. If you haven't, this won't make much sense until you have done. You can find that talk on YouTube, on our Winchester Vineyard YouTube channel. And I suggest that you watch that first, and then what I'm about to say and go through will make a lot more sense. I'm going to switch over to slides now, but you'll still hear my voice talking. So, as I said in my previous talk, we've subtitled this whole series, Jonah, the offensive compassion of God. It's not so much about the man Jonah, it's even less about the fish, but it's all about God. It's all about how God treats his people, how God deals with his people, his compassion and his kindness. And before I get into that, I just want to say a few things that would support the talk I did before. And the first one is just about the place of Jonah in the Bible. If you remember, I said that Jonah is very much thought of as a microcosm of the whole of the Old Testament. Now, in the original Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, it wasn't organised in the same way as it is now. This table shows you on the left hand side, it's the Hebrew way of organising the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. You can see that there are three sections: Torah, Nevi'im or the prophets, and the Kevathim, the writings. It's quite often called the Tanakh because of those TNK three things. That's different obviously to the English Bible. All the same books are there, but they are not organised in the same way. So the way that we know the Old Testament is with the Pentateuch, the history, the poetry and the prophets. And so Jonah comes in the prophets, and it comes towards the end. But the way that Jewish people would have known this book, and the way that Jesus would have read this book, it would have been the way that's shown here on the left. So notice that Jonah comes in the middle of the prophets, and the prophets comes in the middle of the Hebrew Bible, the scriptures. Just a reference from Luke 24 that's there on the screen, that Jesus referred to them. He said, everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets and the Psalms. Okay, so Jesus' way of referring to the Hebrew Bible was the law, the prophets and the Psalms. The Psalms is a shorthand for the writings. The Psalms is part of the writings. And so when Jesus actually references Jonah, we'll come to that later in the series, but this is the Bible that he would have known, and Jonah is slap bang in the middle of it. And this slide here shows just how that works in sort of diagrammatic form. This is a diagram from Tim Mackey in the Bible Project, and you can see that the prophets comes in the middle and Jonah comes in the middle of that. These red circles are just to show the stitchings, the seams between the sections. You'll just notice if you dig into it, it says meditate on the Torah. There's a reference at the end of Deuteronomy and going into Joshua where it says, it basically says it's anticipating the coming of a Moses-like prophet who was promised but actually never came. And then Joshua comes, and in order to enter the promised land, Joshua has to meditate on the Torah day and night. Now you can see that in Joshua chapter 1 in verses 7 and 8. And then it's really interesting because at the end of Malachi, which we think of as the end of the Old Testament, but actually in Jesus' time wasn't the end of the Old Testament, it was the end of the prophets section before you got into the writings. But again, the end of Malachi, there is an anticipation of a coming, actually Elijah-like prophet who will call people back to the Torah. There is always this anticipation there will be a prophet who will come. He'll be like Moses, he'll be like Elijah. He will restore the hearts of Israel. He'll call people back to the land. And obviously we know that ultimately that becomes Jesus. But interestingly, in Psalm 1, again, what it says is to be among the righteous in the final judgment, what you've got to do is meditate on the Torah, meditate on the law day and night to find success. So there are links here, and this is how this seems. These are how the Old Testament Hebrew style, the Hebrew Bible was stitched together, and Jonah comes right in the middle of it. And the references, the cross references in Jonah, I mentioned a few of them, but the hyperlinks in Jonah are literally right across the whole of the Hebrew Bible. There's absolutely tons of them. So that was one thing I wanted to point out. I showed you this morning, and that is the Bible Project's overview of Jonah. And again, you can watch the 10-minute video of this on YouTube, and I recommend that you do. It just gives you a really nice sort of overview, and it also shows very clearly the structure of the book. And for anybody who's wanting to dig into the Bible a bit more, I highly recommend the Bible Project. It's a great place to start, and their resources are incredible. And you can see a lot at the top here how it talks about how Jonah is unique among the prophets, how his only other appearance in the Old Testament, we'll flag that up in a bit. You can see how this is the subversive story of a rebellious prophet who hates God for loving his enemies, and how this is told in satire with extreme circumstances and humour and irony. And so moving on, I mentioned this morning, that the whole idea of the hyperlinks and the fact that words and phrases, actually it's true of every book in the Bible, but it's particularly true of Jonah here. And I mentioned these three hyperlinks, Jonah and Nineveh and Tarshish, and I kind of covered this already, but I just wanted to go back and touch on it in a bit more detail. We mentioned Jonah already, the fact that he has only one other appearance in the Old Testament. He is, as I said, mentioned by Jesus. We'll come to that later, and that's where he, in 2 Kings 14, where he was serving a really bad king. And in fact, Amos the prophet pretty much directly prophesies against Jonah's prophecy. So Jonah goes up to the king and says, hey, God's favour is really with you. Amos later reverses it, and that's what leaves in the mind of the Hebrew audience, that's what makes a big question mark hang over Jonah. It's just like, who is this guy? Is he for real? Is he really one of God's chosen prophets? And doesn't have a good track record? So there are question marks before we've even started. I also mentioned Nineveh, and I mentioned this whole reference to Nineveh being a great city. And I just wanted to read you, in fact, I want to show you a little bit from Genesis chapter 10. I took this screen grab from my study Bible, my online version, and what you can see here, this is Genesis chapter 10, and I'm just going to read verse just go from verse 8 here. It says, Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And from that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. That is the only other reference to that phrase, great city, outside of the book of Jonah. And over on the other side, you can see in the notes from my ESV study Bible, you can see in the notes here that it talks about these details link Nimrod with the Tower of Babel episode. We didn't cover that, but again, this is where the people of Babylon decide that they're going to try and build a tower and get to God. Nimrod's kingdom is the antithesis of what God desired, and the great city, that reference, this probably denotes a region that included both Nineveh and Calah, and then there's the link back to Jonah there. See Jonah 3:3. And so again, this is just a little bit of detail to show how when you say that great city in the context of Jonah, what it's really pointing to is this whole area of Nimrod's kingdom, which is what ultimately becomes Babylon. And as I said earlier, it's the antithesis of everything that God wanted or desired. So that's just a little bit of a background on that. And you know, I mentioned this morning, if you don't have a study Bible, I highly recommend getting one. The ESV study Bible, I have the physical version, and it got me the online link, but I think it's possible just to get the online link. You do have to pay for it. I don't know what the details are now, but it is so worth it. I literally, whenever I'm preparing talks, whenever I'm looking into the Bible, I'm pretty much always using the ESV study Bible as my basic place to go to start with. I don't always read the passage from the ESV because the words can be a little bit tricky and they don't flow as well as perhaps some of the words in the NIV translation or some of the more modern translations. But in terms of the study and in terms of the understanding and the closeness back to what it's saying, I find this to be really, really, really helpful. And in fact, they've got tons of extra articles, some brilliant theology. It's a great place to go. So I also said, if you remember, about Tarshish, and I pointed out how it said 3 times Tarshish, and I've actually put the reference in here from 1 Kings. I said that Tarshish is known, it sort of has a reputation of being a long way away and a place of gold and incredible wealth. And here's just one reference in 1 Kings 10:22. It's talking about Solomon. It says, the king had a fleet of ships of Tarshish at sea with the fleet of Hiram. And once every 3 years, the fleet of ships of Tarshish used to come bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. And thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. Now, I don't have time to show you all of this, but it's effectively in the Old Testament, what you've got going on is you've got a series of characters who are trying to get back to Eden, the perfection of the Garden of Eden. Except they're trying to do it without reference to God. They're trying to do it on their own, and kind of that's what Solomon was doing. The whole of the story of Solomon is God gives him this incredible wisdom, but he decides he's going to build this massive palace, and he kind of gets really carried away with his vision, and so he's trying to recreate that Eden, that perfection, but he's doing it without any reference to God. And so when Tarshish is mentioned, Tarshish is kind of the place where you can try and get perfection without any reference to God. And that's why this is seen as being about as far away from God's presence as you could go back in the day. And so that's just a bit more detail around those hyperlinks. And the hyperlinks exist all over the place, but those are the 3 obvious ones that set this story up. Where are we going to go to next? Right, yeah, I just wanted to show you this. I didn't have time to show you this morning. The first 5 verses of Jonah, I just want you to notice how it mentions the word down 4 different times in this story. You know, it says he went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. He paid the fare and went down into it, meaning into the ship. And then later on in verse 5, it says... the mariners were afraid and they were looking, but Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and he had lain down and was fast asleep. And the word to go down is yarad, and it's associated with death. It's associated with going down to Sheol. Again, it's back to, there's a reference in Genesis about this. And so this whole idea of going down is thinking of death. And so I just wanted to show you how the writer is telling this story. Imagine this story being told, not written, but told, read out loud. And every time he mentions the word down, it's like another step towards death. It's like every step Jonah is taking further and further away from what God is calling him to do is another step down to death. I thought that was just really interesting to note. There's another thing I want to show you. Oh yes, right, so I did show you in my main talk this whole table. I'm not going to go over this again, about where you're looking at the sailor's spiritual understanding and their sort of gradual awareness of God compared with Jonah's complete failure in really understanding or responding to what is going on. And I went through all that this morning, but I want to show you the same passage sort of in a slightly different way, with a bit more reference to the literary aspects of it. First of all, I just wanted you to notice, I hope you can see all this, I've tried to squeeze the whole of this passage onto one page because I wanted to show you the shape of it, and you can see that I've indented the paragraphs, and that's for a specific reason. Before I get to that, I wanted you to notice that he used the same phrase 4 times. Now, I think that the author could have probably found a number of ways of saying that God sent a storm, okay, but he deliberately chooses this phrase about hurling. He says the Lord hurled a great wind on the sea. And then there's an echo there when it says, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea. I wonder if you noticed this when we read it the first time. And then it's echoed again down in verse 12 where Jonah says, pick me up and hurl me into the sea. And then right down in the bottom in verse 15 it says, so they did pick up Jonah and they hurled him into the sea. And I was going to make a joke to say there's a whole lot of hurling going on here, and it isn't seasickness either. And it's just a literary device. It's kind of like one of those things where you keep repeating certain phrases to keep the audience engaged and listening. It's very much like a kid's book where you would perhaps tell a story, you would say a phrase and then you'd repeat the phrase through the story. And so you can tell that this has been written with dramatic retelling in mind. And now I want this is the last little bit of this video, but I want to show you what's going on in this passage in terms of some of the key words. This is called a chiasm. The way that a lot of Hebrew scripture is originally written in the original language, it's written like this, and you'll see what I'm about to show you is that it's symmetrical. Okay, it's sort of written in passages, a bit like a rhyme scheme or something like that. And so I don't have them, but you can see that the top and the bottom paragraphs here, I've rearranged the paragraphs, by the way. You could call those A, and the next one's in B, and the next one's in C. And the reason for that is because it has the same phrases. So in the top paragraph, verse 5, it says the mariners were afraid and cried out to his God, right? Cried out to their gods. They're afraid and they cried out to their gods. Now look down the bottom, and obviously the story's changed by the end. It says the men feared the Lord exceedingly. So they're still afraid, but a different kind of fear. And they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. And so there's a real link between these two phrases. It's like bookends of the story. At the beginning they're afraid or feared and they cry out to their gods. At the end they fear the Lord, the God. Then you'll see the Lord has a capital L. Yahweh is the original phrase, and they offer the sacrifice to the Lord. So they're kind of the bookends of this story. And then if you look the next 2 chapters here, I've shown this in green. Again, there's a real link between the language here. So the captain says to Jonah, call out to your God, because perhaps he'll give a thought to us that we might not perish. That's the key. There's the key language. Call out to your God. We don't want to perish. We don't want to die. And again, you can see there's a real link down here in verse 14 where it says, so therefore, again, this is now the sailors calling out to the Lord God. So in the first one, the captain's telling Jonah to call out to his God on their behalf. Now the sailors are calling out to the Lord, do not let us perish for this man's life. So there's calling out and there's we don't want to perish. And again, there's that link there. And you can see and you can imagine what's coming next. There's another little bit of symmetry here, slightly different literary device, where it says, then they said to him and he said to them. And then again in 11 and 12, they said to him and he said to them. So the shape of the way this is written is all focusing in towards the middle. Now in one of these Hebrew chiasms, in this type of literature, it's all pointing towards the middle phrase. And you can see that the middle phrase is kind of the crux of the whole passage. It's kind of the central bit. And I've done it in red because it's the same as the first bit and the last bit. The men were exceedingly afraid, and they said to him, what have you done? Because they knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord. Okay, the men were, so again you've got fear and you've got the presence of the Lord there. And this is the key phrase of the whole passage. And I did kind of cover this morning in my other talk. I talked about how this is the part where the spiritual awakening of these sailors begins to happen, because they realise what Jonah's done or hasn't done. They realise that there is a God who is in charge of this storm, who has sent this storm, and they realise that Jonah is running away from his God, and they need to do something about that. They need to respond to that, and that's why this is the key part of the phrase. So I love that you can track these sailors' journey right from the start, where they were afraid and crying out to their own gods, through to they were afraid of the Lord God of heaven and earth, Yahweh God, because they realised that Jonah was running away from him. What a dangerous thing to do. And then it keeps going down and down until right at the end of the passage, the men are now fearing the Lord, the God of heaven and earth. They feared him exceedingly, and they're offering sacrifices to him and making their own vows. I hope that has made sense, and that you find that interesting and enlightening and exciting. As I said at the end of the story, Jonah finishes up in the sea, and obviously we'll find out what happens to him next week when we look into chapter 2, although you can read it yourselves. I just wanted to finish with this quote from Tim Mackey in the Bible Project. He said this: "In the book of Jonah, everything is upside down. Everybody does the opposite of their stereotypes, including the pagans and including Jonah. The only person who seems true to form is God." And we're going to find out more about that as we go through the next few weeks. So guys, I hope you found that interesting, and I have a few questions which I thought might be helpful if anybody wanted to take some time now just to reflect on what we've been talking about. So I've got 4 questions here. The first one is, what ideas or preconceptions do you bring to the story of Jonah from your own previous experiences? What did you already know about this story? What did you think about this story? The second one is a quote from my first talk. Tim Mackey said that the Old Testament is painting a picture and a job description for the Messiah. I wonder what you feel about this. I wonder where it resonates with you. I wonder what questions it raises for you. It should raise some questions for you, and it'd be good to reflect on that. Another one is there any way in which Jonah's actions in chapter 1 reflect your own experiences, either now or in the past? And lastly, is there any way in which the sailors' actions in chapter 1 also reflect your own experiences? Be great to spend some time reflecting on that. And if you do have any feedback for me or any comments or questions, I don't know if this is really helpful. It might be great to get together at the end of this session and just do a call together where we might want to discuss and reflect on these things together. Let me know whatever feedback you've got. In the meantime, thank you for listening and being part of this, and hopefully see you very soon.